The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Bill Betancourt with the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and welcome to today's Get Real webinar, Surviving the Streets, Experiences of LGBTQ Youth, YMSM, YWSW, Engaged in Survival Sex. Before we get started, a few logistics. If you are calling in, please call in from a landline and avoid using a speakerphone or a cellular phone because that can create problems with static and other background noise. If you are having sound quality, sometimes it helps if you hang up and call back in, and that sometimes resolves a problem with the bad connection. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be sharing it with the members of the network, and it will also be posted on our website, www.cssp.org. At the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So as you hear the presentation, if there are questions that come up for you, please use the question feature in your control panel. We'll gather the questions and ask them after the presentation. Also, we will be sending out a survey as usual after the webinar, and we appreciate your filling that out and sending it back in. It's a short survey that gives us a sense of how you rated the webinar and also any ideas you have for future webinars so that we can continue a webinar series that provides the information and support and resources that are helpful to you. Today's presenter is Dr. Meredith Danks, who is a senior researcher at the Urban Institute. Her areas of focus include human trafficking, teen dating violence, LGBTQ issues, and victimization. She serves as principal investigator on over a dozen research studies examining labor and sex trafficking both domestically and internationally. An expert in human trafficking, Dr. Danks has conducted research in 8 countries and took part in a White House stakeholder meeting on victim services for survivors. She is the author of the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. Welcome, Meredith.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to do this presentation today, and welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time to listen in. I'm going to go over the main findings of the study that was released several weeks ago, and just so everybody knows, I think Bill sent out a link to the full study, but if you did not receive it, you can find a copy of it on www.urban.org, and the first basically feature that you'll see on the website is for this particular study. Before I get into, sorry, I don't know why I'm having trouble. There we go. Before I get into the findings, I did want to go over terminology so that you can understand and follow along with kind of the selection and reasons why we chose the terminology that we did. So the first thing is youth engaged in survival sex. There's a lot of other terms that people use to describe this population. Other terms you might have heard are maybe commercially sexually exploited youth or trafficked youth. But we felt that youth engaged in survival sex best encapsulated the experiences of the young people we interviewed, and particularly this is the language that they used to describe the situations and the experiences that they had. It also talks about the behavior and that they engage in survival sex and does not label the youth themselves as one that has been trafficked or sexually exploited, which is something that the young people felt again, describe their experiences better and were more comfortable with. So that's why we went ahead and used the term youth engaged in survival sex. Exploiter is an individual who uses tactics involving force, fraud, and coercion to control a young person's involvement in the commercial sex market. Again, this is a term that the youth felt best described that person who played that role in their lives. And then a peer facilitator, which I think is a really important term, and something that I'll explain throughout the presentation, is a young person who may or may not be engaged in survival sex themselves, but more times than not, they are engaged in survival sex, who provide non-exploitative support to someone engaging in survival sex. These are other young people who are not expecting anything in return, so they're not using force, fraud, or coercion, and they're not expecting any kind of monetary benefit or any other material benefit from that relationship. Oftentimes, it's a young person who is doing this to have their basic needs met, who meets another young person who is in a similar situation, and they share those experiences and those tactics with that young person. The methods, which I won't get into too much detail about because there's a lot of ground I'm hoping to cover, but this is a study that used a methodology called respondent-driven sampling, which is essentially snowball sampling but more systematic. And the way it works is that you find young people, what we call seeds, who are brave enough to come forward first and be interviewed, and we found those young people through our contacts with service providers and other community members in New York City. And then we would interview them. They would receive a small monetary incentive, and then they would receive additional monetary incentives to recruit other young people that they knew were also, our age range was between 13 to 21, who identified as LGBTQ. YMSM is young men who have sex with men. YWSW is young women who have sex with women. And we use those terms to describe young people identified as heterosexual but had sex with members of the same sex in exchange for money and or material goods. And they had to be involved in survival sex in some way in New York. So they recruited those young people, and we ended up with 283 interviews. We worked in partnership with an organization called Streetwise and Safe, which is a New York City-based organization that works with LGBTQ youth of color. And we worked to train a handful of young people who were part of that organization to help conduct the interviews with the young people, because we felt that young people would feel more comfortable opening up to other young people who they felt came from similar experiences. And we found that that was a really good way to move forward with this project. And if anybody has questions, particularly around that, I'm happy to answer those at the end of the webinar. All the interviews were anonymous and confidential, so we didn't take down any identifying information from any of the young people that we interviewed. We used, as part of this methodology, sampling. They would call a 1-800 number. Each person would get a unique identifier number, and that number is how we knew, or how we basically documented who that person was. So the research questions, we didn't, as you can see there's a number of bullet points there. We decided to break up the findings into various pieces, because we felt that if we released a several hundred-page report, a lot of the findings would get lost, and we wanted to make sure that all the important pieces that people felt that they could get through the report, which is currently, this one is 80 pages, and then release some of the other major findings over time. So in the report that's out now, we cover in detail the youth characteristics, the methods of entry into the commercial sex market, the network size and characteristics of the clients, their friends, and associates. We talk a little bit about the health and legal consequences, although that will go into more detail in future pieces that we'll be releasing. We did, again, talk a bit about services, but hope to cover that in more detail in the future. And then the next piece that we'll be releasing will be around their interactions with law enforcement, courts, and detention. So as far as the findings go, I'm going to go, the next several slides will be around the demographics of the young people that we interviewed. So for Birthplace, 2 in 3 youth were born and or raised in New York City, which is quite a high number. I think when people think of New York, particularly for LGBTQ youth, that there's a lot of young people coming in from out of the state or out of the city, because this is a place where they feel they could be accepted and there are resources that are available to them, which we did find for many of the youth that we interviewed, which they then faced a grim reality that although there are resources, there just aren't enough, and it's really difficult to find employment in New York. But I think what's interesting or important to note that many of the young people were born in New York and were essentially homeless in their hometown and did not have that support network that you would expect a young person to have in the place where they were born and raised. 3 in 4 respondents were born and raised in the tri-state area, so it would be actually New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. As far as gender, a little less than half identified as male, a little over 35 or a little over a third identified as female. 11% identified as transgender female, 3% identified as transgender male. And you can see the breakdown and the 3% that identified as other, which included the categories to the right. It's really important to note that this is the first study to really document the experiences of trans boys who engage in survival sex. So although it was only a sample of 3%, I think that the experiences that we were able to document and share are really important because it shows that there are specific needs for this population that oftentimes do not get addressed. And this is probably one of, if not the largest study to document such a large percentage of the experiences of trans girls. So I think as far as the transgender sample altogether is a fairly good sample. For sexual orientation, 37% identified as bisexual, 23% identified as gay, 15% identified as lesbian, and 13% identified as heterosexual, going back to those are the young people that we identified as YMSM, YWSW. And what's important about that are their experiences, and there's a section in the report that delves into more detail about that. And you know, what their experiences are and what their needs are for that particular population. For race, the vast majority of young people that we interviewed were youth of color. 39% identified as Black or African American, 17% identified as Latino, and 33% identified with more than one race and or ethnicity. Only 5% identified as white. I've been asked many times why the sample is predominantly youth of color. I don't have a particular answer to give towards that. I think there are a number of factors that one could potentially raise as why that might be, but without having the specific data to kind of back that up, all I can say is that the vast majority of the young people that we interviewed were youth of color. As far as education, most youth were not currently enrolled in school, although almost half had neither graduated high school nor obtained a GED, despite being of an age where, you know, if they had followed the traditional route, would have received one of those. Of those currently enrolled in school, 39% reported not having attended class within the year before their interview. For their living situation, and I should stress that this is their living situation at the point of being interviewed. We do ask them how long they've lived in that particular place, and that information is in the report, but just to get an understanding of what their housing is like. Almost half lived in a shelter at the time of the interview. 11% lived in a family home. And that included youth who had always lived with the family, and then youth who were on and off, so sometimes would stay with their family for maybe a night or two, and then maybe bounce to a friend's home or spend a couple nights in a shelter. 10% were living on the streets, 10% lived in a friend's home. Again, a lot of that looked more like couch surfing than more of a stable, consistent place for that they were living, and 9% had their own place or apartment. So the age that they first engaged in survival sex, the average age overall was 17 years of age. Most youth were between 15 to 18, the full range being 7 to 22. We did interview a handful of young people who were over the age of 21, simply for the fact that they had a decent-sized peer network that included young people who were in our age range, and since this methodology is all about people recruiting within their peer networks, we thought it would be to our advantage to interview those individuals, and all of the ones we interviewed also had started engaging in survival sex under the age of 18. And one thing to point out is that I think that there is a lot you'll see a lot in the media and around that the average age of young people who are engaging in this keeps getting younger and younger, 11 and 12. But as far as like data, empirical data to back that up, that isn't quite there. The research that has been done has actually shown that the average age is between 15, 16, 17. So, and if you think about where young people are at that time in their lives, for many of them, that's right around the time that if they're in the foster care system, they start aging out, start thinking about, where they're going to be living next and how they're going to get their needs met. But for those young people who might be living at home or, in maybe another type of situation, that's when they start gaining a little bit more sense of independence and feeling that they could kind of go out on their own and figure out ways to survive on their own. So how they first engage in survival sex, a large majority of them, 42%, was through friends or peers. Again, this goes back to people who may, although they didn't, when we coded this the way that they explained what the relationship was at the time when they first engaging. So you only see that only 1%, the way that they described that relationship with that person, considered that person a peer facilitator. However, relationships, particularly for young people with their peers, changes over time. So something that we talk about a bit in the report is that for the 42%, although they describe that person as a friend or a peer, when they first met them, when they first started engaging in survival sex, that relationship could have turned into more of a peer facilitator, but also could have turned into an exploitative situation. So there are cases where young people talked about how they were essentially recruited by somebody they thought was a friend for an exploiter. But of those who were directly recruited by an exploiter, that was only 6%. So I'm just going to go over a couple of quotes that describe some of the experiences that young people had first engaging in survival sex. So for this 21-year-old black gay male, I don't remember it that vividly. All I know is just that I was starving. My friend was like, come with a stroll. Trust me, you'll get somebody. I was hungry. I was cold, so I did it. We heard, time and time again from young people that one of the biggest drivers was not only housing instability and a lack of a bed to go to, but was just simply that they didn't have any food and they were starving. For many of the young people that we interviewed, they would actually come in and hadn't eaten either in the last couple of hours or in some cases in the last 24 to 48 hours. So food insecurity is a huge issue with the population. For this 20-year-old black bisexual female, he came up to me. He was like, "Hi, how are you doing? You're kind of beautiful. Thank you." He asked me for my number, and so I gave him my number. Met up with him. I didn't know he was a pimp, but I found out, but whatever. I needed the money, so I got to do what I got to do, survive out there because it's not easy on the streets. She needed the money. So I think that what's interesting around this is that for this young woman, she knew that this person was a pimp from the very beginning, but she felt that, he was basically the person who was going to be able to help her get the money that she needed and get her other basic needs met. And then for this 21-year-old white straight transsexual, again, I want to stress that all young people could identify however they wanted to identify. So all the labels that you see are just self-identified labels. I didn't really think about, trading sex for anything whenever I first moved here. And then whenever I got here, I realized it was just so popular because there were so many people in my situation that were unemployed and needed money. It was just so widely, it was easy to get into. So I was a very conservative person. I didn't really think about doing that, but times got really, really hard, and I didn't eat for about a week, and I didn't have anywhere to stay. Sneaking on the train, so I decided I was going to clean myself up for a little bit, decided to go out there and do what I had to do. So this goes back again to not eating, not having a place to go, not having, really any access to employment, let alone living wage employment. So this person saw that what other people were doing to survive and decided on their own initiative that they would do the same. And then this is a quote from a 20-year-old black male, heterosexual, came to the point where my mother kicked me out of the house and I was staying with him, so pretty much he was paying everything for me, so I really didn't have a choice. I didn't know how to handle it because he was still basically giving me my financial needs. So I would say no, then he just came, I know you take care of your girlfriend and stuff like that. I couldn't say no because at the time she was pregnant. figured I'm sacrificing myself, my body for somebody else. I felt like I'm doing a good thing. We heard a similar narrative from several other young black male heterosexuals, that they either had a wife and a child or a girlfriend who was pregnant, or in some cases just had several siblings and they were helping to take care of them because maybe it was a single-parent home and the income was just not enough. And so this was something that they felt they were ultimately sacrificing themselves to be able to support others in their lives. So what did they receive in exchange for a sexual act? These are not mutually exclusive categories, so they could have picked as many, or they could have said as many as we wanted, and we coded as many as they stated. 88% said money. I do want to say that could have been as little as $5, all the way up to several $100s. Shelter was 29%, food was 19%, and you can see the other types of things that they were exchanging sex for. So as far as situations involving an exploiter, which was somebody where there was evidence of force, fraud, and coercion, if you remember the statistic a couple slides ago, 6% had first started trading sex through being recruited by an exploiter. However, over time, 14.5% of youth had been involved in an exploitative situation involving a trafficker or an exploiter. And I think this really highlights that young people's experiences are not static. They're quite fluid and change over time. So a young person who might enter into this one way doesn't mean that that's going to be their sole experience while engaging in this, that things can change really quickly, sometimes even overnight. Sometimes it takes several months, several years. So it's really important when you are working with young people and trying to talk to them about this, is to try to get the full history of their experiences and not just at that point in time what their situation is. So here's just some quotes around the dangers of being involved with an exploiter. Every time I would think of running and thinking about going to the cops, he would say, if you go to the cops, I will kill you and stuff like that. So it was like I didn't have nobody to run to. I couldn't go back home or anything. He would just keep me confined in a house unless I had to do something. We'd go shopping or something. He would be right there. And if he's not with me, he was watching. He has somebody watching me. This is from another young woman. I'm with some other girl, and we go to use the bathroom somewhere, and a guy comes with a setup. He's like, you know, you're mine. I'm like, no, I'm not. I've got to go. And he goes like, you have to do what I say. You can't leave until you make me a certain amount of money. He beat me all types of stuff and locked me in a room. So I'm in the room for 3 days, and he's like, okay, now you'll go do what you have to do to make me a certain amount of money. You can leave. I was gone like the wind as soon as I got out there. So just one thing, sorry, that I want to say around that. These are two quotes from two young women. And we found that there was significance that if you are a young cisgender female, you did have a higher likelihood of being in an exploitative situation at some point during their experience engaging in survival sex or trading sex. That said, there were a number of young trans women, boys, and trans boys and boys who also had experiences being in an exploitative situation. So it's not just, you know, exploiters are not focused solely on recruiting cisgender females, that this is something that any young person is vulnerable to. So how do they find customers? 59%, again, this is not mutually exclusive, 59% posted ads online, 48% were on the streets, working particularly on a stroll. And then how did they protect themselves? 33% carried a knife or blade, 20% had mace, 13% said they would use their fists if anything if they were assaulted or anything else happened, whereas 19% said that they wouldn't even use their fists, they had no protection, and that they would most likely just give in to whatever situation was happening. Some would say that they would try to run and see what happened in that case. Criminal justice involvement, again, is not really covered in the report that's released now, but I just wanted to go over 2 quick slides to just give you a sense of how they're involved in the criminal justice system. One thing to keep in mind is that New York is fairly unique in the country, and that 16 and 17-year-olds are processed as adults in the criminal justice system and not in family court or juvenile justice court. So, you know, that's where things differ considerably because of that for the young people in New York City. But as far as arrests go, only 29% had never been arrested at all in their lives. A quarter had only been arrested once, but as you can see, that actually as it gets higher, the more young people have the experiences of being 9% had 11 or more experiences of being arrested, have been arrested 11 or more times, 11% have been arrested 6 to 10 times. So these are young people who are seeing the criminal and juvenile justice systems quite a bit, and the things that they're getting arrested for are not prostitution. Only 4.9% have been ever arrested on prostitution-related charges. So if law enforcement and people in the courts are only looking to flag young people who might be engaging in survival sex or might be trafficked by whether or not they've been arrested on prostitution-related charges, then you could see that they're going to flag very few young people. A lot of them are being arrested on quality of life crimes or misdemeanors. I mean, you could see that almost 12% have been arrested on jumping the turnstile, which means in New York that essentially you didn't pay your fare to get on the subway, which is $2.50. And oftentimes it's because they didn't have the $2.50 to pay for the subway ride. And in that case, they would get a fine, which many of them couldn't pay. Then they would you know, have to go to a court appearance, which many of them couldn't afford to get to the court. And then they would have a bench warrant out for their arrest. So you could see how this is a vicious cycle that kind of keeps young people because of once you have a record, getting access to housing, getting employment, and all these other things that they would need to be able to stop engaging in things like survival sex are really difficult. So now about their feelings about trading sex. So for this young male, he was talking about some of the positive things, but you can see it's really complex kind of how he's laying it out. He said you can trade sex for the life of your kids, you can trade sex to keep your apartment, you can trade sex to feed yourself. Some people think that the sex trade is the worst thing you do because you're selling yourself, but when it boils down to it, if you have no food in your stomach, if you have no transportation, but you have a man in your face willing to give you money for a half hour, you put your pride to the side, you throw everything out the window, and you forget who you are, you forget what you're doing, you learn to be someone else. I think this also shows for at least a handful of the young people that we interviewed, they chose to engage in trading sex because they felt that if anybody is going to be a victim in all of this, they prefer to just be the only victim in whatever they were engaging in, as opposed to if they were dealing drugs or committing, you know, robbery or theft. You know, that was not something that they wanted to do to somebody else. Another thing about the positives of trading is it's not as bad as sleeping under the bridge. It's not as bad as going without food. It's not as bad as walking around selling cocaine or other narcotics. It's just not as bad as being that person without, period. Whereas the negatives, as this young person lays out, and this quote was a lot longer in the report. We cut it down to fit on the slide, but there's a safety issue. You don't know what's going on. You don't know where you don't know like what, you don't have basically control of the situation in a way, so you never know if this person might physically abuse you. It also brings out your fear because you never know what's going to happen. There's also the nervousness about what will happen if your friends find out, how they will look at your stuff like that. There's a whole lot of emotional aspect to it, and that's because it's like a memory that's scarred into your life, and it's hard to cope with it, especially how you like to have to keep things away from friends or family. It's hard, and if you have to open up to some people, it's like you don't know how they're going to react, and it's something you always want to release, so it's really hard. And I think this particular quote really speaks to how much young people want to talk about their experiences. For the vast majority of young people we interviewed, it was almost a cathartic experience to be able to talk to somebody knowing that we weren't collecting and identifying information. Because they hadn't told anybody before, and they felt this was a safe space where they could share this information and not be judged or discriminated against. And this is where, you know, being able to build trust and a relationship with the young people is really important if you are going to get them to open up about these experiences. So as far as their desire to stop engaging in survival sex, 67% reported wanting to stop at some point, and 5% said they wanted to stop immediately. I think some young people kind of hesitated to say immediately because they just simply didn't know what they would be able to do next to get their basic needs met. So it was something that they knew that they wanted to stop, but X, Y, and Z needed to happen in order for them to do that. 21% at the time had already stopped. Something to also keep in mind with that is, we heard a lot from young people that they would stop, and then when times got really hard, they would go back into it. And so again, this shows that their experiences are not static and quite fluid, and this is something that youth felt that they could kind of fall back on when times got really hard. And then 7% said they had no desire to stop. So for this young man, in order to stop engaging, he said, I just need my own apartment and stuff. I need my own apartment, a stable job, like not even a stable job. I would take work at Burger King if it meant I could pay my rent and pay my expenses and this time have some left over. I would do that. I'm not a very complex person. I'm very content with my life. So many of the young people said they weren't looking for, high salaried positions, that just any kind of livable wage where they could pay for rent and pay for food and their other basic necessities would be completely good for them and fine for them. This young woman said, I think the survey is a great way for people to comment and get their voices heard about what's going on, because a lot of time when we face a lot of institutions, they don't take a walk in our shoes, and if they did, they don't acknowledge it. And that's the whole reason they got there in the first place. And it's really sad that a lot of times people get shafted, and they're just trying to do the thing, and it's like, I didn't want to have to sell sex. It was my family wasn't helping me, and I'm an only child. My mom was sick. It was just what I was supposed to do. I ain't going to sell no drugs. I'm just going to go over just the main findings, many of which I've already covered, so I won't belabor that too much. But youth reported experience of social and familial discrimination and rejection, familial dysfunction, familial poverty, physical abuse, sexual abuse and exploitation, and emotional and mental trauma. We didn't code. It was a little too difficult just based on the narratives that we heard. So we don't have like a statistics of how many young people were kicked or thrown out of their homes because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, but I can say that was a narrative that we heard quite frequently from the young people we interviewed. The second bullet point is something I've repeated a couple times, is that their experiences are not static and change over the course of their involvement. For example, young people might be recruited by an exploiter but then eventually trade independently to meet their basic needs or vice versa. I think it's important to keep in mind that LGBTQ youth tend to have large peer networks, which include youth engaged in survival sex. Many are introduced to the survival sex economy through such peer networks, but those peer networks are really important to those young people. Essentially, these are the families that they form if they've been kicked out or thrown out of their home, or if they've run away because of the abuse that they're experiencing. So, I think that there are some who might feel that criminalization, I'm not saying anyone on this webinar, but I think in the field maybe criminalizing some of the youth in these peer networks who might be serving more of that role of non-exploitative peer facilitator. But I think, if you don't, again, look at the relationship in its entirety and see that, again, for many of these young people, they're helping each other out to survive because they're in similar circumstances, then that becomes problematic. As far as what they lack access to and need, would be voluntary and low threshold services. For many of the young people, they felt that in order to get access to certain beds or certain training programs, they had to either identify as a victim of some sort or be involved in the criminal justice or juvenile justice systems and be diverted into those programs. So they couldn't just walk into any drop-in center or shelter and necessarily get the services that maybe other young people were getting because they didn't fall within the criteria, the restrictions that the young person needed to do to be able to get access to like a job readiness program. Short and long-term housing, affordable housing and shelter options, livable wage employment, food security, gender-affirming health care is something that came up particularly a number of times from the trans girls and boys that we interviewed, and that in many states, if you're under the age of 18, you can't get access, at least through Medicare or through any other programs, to hormones and other medically necessary treatments. So they would turn to then survival sex to pay for black market hormones and things of that sort. And then their experiences with arrests of quality of life crimes and misdemeanor crimes. It perpetuates the need to engage in survival sex. And then youth experience violence from multiple sources, including families, exploiters, clients, strangers, peers, law enforcement, and including service providers and residents in the shelters that they stay in. But I think overall, one of the key findings that I think is really important to remember is that the youth are extremely resilient in the face of external challenges and internal challenges, and that they find ways to survive, often relying on their informal networks, quick learning abilities to share resources and skills to adapt to difficult and often dangerous situations. That's why, I think it's really important to highlight when you talk to young people that this is something that, really shows their resilience. And then quickly, I'll just go over the recommendations. Develop accessible street-based and comprehensive drop-in services. I think the peer-led outreach is really important, and what we found by training young people to conduct the interviews with young people is just, again, that immediate rapport and trust that's built in. So being able to train young people to actually go out and do the outreach, I think is really important in building trust. Of course, improving safe and supportive and affirming short-term shelter or long-term affordable housing and family-based placement options. The important key there, subject to periodic review, create safe and supportive housing and placement protocols specific to transgender and gender nonconforming individuals, broaden access to and improve gender-affirming health care, adopt non-discrimination, confidentiality and compliant procedures and shelters programs and out-of-home placements, develop living wage employment opportunities, improve food security among LGBTQ youth, design police training curricula to improve relationships. That's something we'll delve more deeply into the next round of findings. And lastly, include uniform survey questions on screening tools and intake forms. I think a lot of how policy is shaped and how funding kind of flows is knowing the scope and size of the population, and without knowing how many young people identify as LGBTQ, particularly in the child welfare system or in the juvenile justice system, then that it makes it really difficult to then push policy forward and ultimately funding. And then encourage federal, state, and local government interagency coordination. So that is everything.
Wow, thank you, Meredith. That's a lot of information.
Yeah, sorry.
We do have a number of questions. A question was asked about whether or not we would be sharing the PowerPoint of this presentation afterwards, and we will. We'll send it out to members of the network, and if you are not a member of our Get Real network, you can request the PowerPoint through our website, www.cssp.org, and we'll send it out to you. One of the questions was about whether or not there were any numbers you had about, among the sample of young people, any current or former involvement with juvenile justice and child welfare, not just arresting, but being under supervision of either of the systems.
Can you divide number, say that again?
Oh, did
Sorry.
you have any numbers around how many of the young people you interviewed had any current or former active involvement with juvenile justice or the child welfare system?
So that were currently at the time of the interview, if they were currently involved. No, we didn't capture.
Or prior.
Or prior. Well, for the, as far as the arrest goes, the fact that only 29% had never been arrested. So that means that about 70% had at some point contact with the juvenile criminal justice systems. As far as the child welfare system, we found that the asking questions specifically or directly about that can be triggering. So if they wanted to self-disclose, we allowed them to do that. And then when we asked them like questions around courts, you know, we'd ask about family court involvement. But because it was really difficult to quantify based on the fact that we didn't directly ask them that question, we don't have that number.
Okay. Did you have any sense, you talked about young people and how they looked at defending themselves when they needed to. Did you have any link between the arrests for assaults and young people engaged in defending themselves?
No, because I think it would be way too difficult to make that link because we would need to, I mean, that could be like a whole separate study as far as, you know, what that would look like. One thing that, you know, we learned fairly on is when you try to get very detailed information from the young people about numbers and, you know, specific stories and things of that sort, it got a little difficult. So, you know, where we would probably have liked a little bit more detail, we didn't always get it.
Okay. You said that 59% of youth engage in survival sex through posting ads online. And is there any research or analysis on the impacts of social media and youth engaging in survival sex, specifically whether or not any apps like Jacked or Adam for Adam or sites such as Craigslist make youth feel more or less safe when engaging in survival sex?
I can't say that social media apps in particular make them feel more safe, but the report does go into detail about why young people post online, and that would include on sites like what you just mentioned. And you know, one thing that we did hear a number of times was that they did feel it was safer because they could vet the potential clients better that way. Also, they felt it was safer from law enforcement detection.
Okay.
But for a number of the youth, their ultimate goal was to build up a number of regulars, which were people that they felt, you know, most comfortable around and felt that they could get more out of, not only, you know, money or material-wise, but also in some cases emotionally. So for many of the young people, they had at least one regular.
Okay. I think you covered the next question somewhat in the report, but I'll ask it anyway in case. This report provides a lot of insight into the complexity of survival sex. Many youth engage in survival sex through their own self-determination, but also because of lack of support or resources. Is there any research or stories from the young people about policy implications for the field, or did the young people talk about programs that support them?
Yes, and that's what we hope to cover in more detail with the future findings, was specifically around their experiences receiving services. And I think there is one really wonderful quote that does highlight, you know, some of the great services that do exist out there, which it's fairly long. So I would just direct people to look at page 65 and read that long quote. But basically he was saying how, I mean, I think what's unfortunate, the way he was describing it, was he didn't know these services existed. And if he had known that was a place he could have gone for help after his mother had abandoned him and his sister, then he would have gone there without feeling that survival sex was his only option. So they did talk a lot about, you know, the services that they did receive and how they were beneficial. But there was definitely a sense that it was just under-resourced, and that, you know, constantly having to wait on a 2-week waiting list for a bed was just really discouraging and really difficult to plan around. So if you don't have an address, you can't apply for a job, and all those things that kind of go around not having a stable address at the end of the day. But for many of them, they did appreciate the services that they were receiving. Not all young people that we spoke with were hooked into services, so we did give out information on where they could find more information about that. But yeah, so I think that there was a sense that services are good. They wish there were more of them. And I think for them, having their voice heard in this was like the first time anybody was really listened. We would always ask them about, the future and what they feel needed to change, particularly around even law enforcement and courts and things of that sort. And they gave us a lot of good feedback around that.
Great. And lastly, can you just give us a sense of the upcoming releases, kind of the period of time? I know you're working on it, but
yeah,
releases of future findings that
yeah, so
look forward to.
The law enforcement and to what extent we can talk about child welfare involvement. Hopefully that will be out in the next month or two.
Okay.
But don't hold me to that just in case. But that's the first piece that's going to come out, and then hopefully it's just hard to gather the time and it's a lot of information to sift through. So the other piece or two will hopefully be later this summer. But
great.
We obviously, if in an ideal world, we would get this out as quickly as possible.
And as they get released, I'm sure we can send them out to our network.
Absolutely.
And post them on our website for folks, so that would be great.
Absolutely.
Okay, well that's it, Meredith.
Great.
This was really great, and I appreciate it. Thanks so much, everyone. Again, we'll send out the recorded version of the webinar and post it on our website afterwards.
And people can also contact me with any questions if they have them.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.